Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Why It Matters. I'm Tracy Kronzak, Director of Innovation here at Now It Matters, and I'm joined by my co-host, Tim Lockey.
Everybody, thanks for joining us.
Today's guest is someone who I personally have had threaded interactions with over the span, I believe, of about 10 years or more. And I just want to say, Cheryl, I am honored to have you here because I'm both delighted to reconnect with you in 2021. And I've also had some of the most incredible conversations with you about what it means to look at our world and be visionary about where we want to go, but also be pragmatic about what we want to do, and unpicking things like bias and race and how do we serve nonprofits. And I feel like you're a person who's done so much. It's just a great pleasure to have you here. And I'll let you tell folks what you're on about now in 2021. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you, Tracy and Tim, for having me. I would say back at you, Tracy. I mean, I remember our conversations well, and just, thinking about, wow, they are so smart, they are really smart. And I wish I could find a way to spend more time talking to this amazing, brilliant person. So this is a pleasure for me. So I'll tell a little bit about myself. I am the chair and founder of Do Big Things. Do Big Things is a digital agency that works with leading candidates, causes, corporations, and campaigns to provide the new narrative and new tech for the new era in which we're living today. I'm also the Chief Innovation Officer at the Impact Seat. The Impact Seat is a venture fund that focuses on investing in the ideas that solve the world's biggest problems with an eye towards diverse founders, because diverse-led firms win. We do that through a three-pronged approach of investment, advocacy, and philanthropy.
That's amazing. And by the way, like throughout all of that, one of the threads is the technology we use in the future we want to see. And we arrived at this point in our pregame for the conversation, but I want to open up with the question of, Cheryl, what is that future? What does that future look like? And what is the actual real implications, good, bad, and ugly, for how we're all acting right now? Because there's a lot embedded in the answer you gave us, and I want our listeners to hear it.
Well, it is a big question, and I don't necessarily have a crystal ball, but because I tend to think differently than other people, I've tended to, I think, be pretty good at calling the next challenge ahead of us. Look, we're headed into a challenging time. There's no question about that. And I think there's a lot of wishful thinking about the end. When is this going to end, and when can we go back to normal? And that's not going to happen. Okay, we're never going to go back to the way things were. I think in particular, for example, the Great Resignation. People in the face of random and potentially early mortality looked around and said, I don't think I want to do this anymore, whatever it is. And I certainly want to be treated better if I'm going to do something differently. And so that's putting a lot of pressure on, the powers that be, including small business owners, but even, big companies, big platforms. No matter what organization you're in, you're likely having to make some changes in order to retain and attract your people. And that's going to happen for a while. I had to have this conversation with one of the folks that we fund. One of the funds that we fund, those funds invest in other diverse-led firms. And they were trying to recruit an expert in HubSpot, to their specific, relatively small Californian city, and they specialize in fintech. I was like, yeah, that person isn't there and they're not going to come in the office. Like, even if you could find that person in your city, which might be difficult, they don't have to come to the office if they don't want to. And I've heard a lot of that, that people just don't even, they look, especially women on whom the pandemic has been, very difficult, for women and families, they understand now how amazing remote work can be in terms of being able to manage your own schedule, which is so important, especially when you're talking about navigating childcare. So on that front, I think, and on a number of different fronts, people just don't want the same. And another thing I think that's important to note is this time is going to go on longer than people think. Like, it's going to take us longer even to get to the post period. I would guess another 12 to 24 months. Why is that? In this country, we still have large areas of the country that are dealing with rising cases of COVID, or lots of cases of COVID at the time that we're talking. Holidays are coming up. People are going to be gathering, right? Like, the same thing happened last year. We know we've seen this movie before. And because poor countries are having trouble getting access to the vaccine because the pharmaceutical companies don't want to give up the formula to have it be made in country, capitalism at work. The same thing could happen. Delta came from a country where the vaccines were unavailable. There's nothing to prevent another highly contagious, even more lethal version of COVID making the rounds. So you should assume that we might cycle through this, in part because the systems that got us here aren't the systems that are going to get us out of it. Whether it's inequality, whether it's climate change, whether it is putting this disease to bed and ensuring healthcare. So that's my my take. And one of the things I do a fair number of podcasts, and some of them are more business related, like really hardcore. These are people who are not necessarily impact entrepreneurs, for example. What I've been saying is, look, map your business/life strategy to the world that is coming, not the world that you see around you today, because that world is disappearing before our eyes. And so it's really important, to look at the ways in which things have changed and start to map in that direction, not hope that the changes that you've had to make and will make in this time, that you can abandon them later.
Do you think that that is really insightful? Thank you. And I don't hear anything there that seems incorrect or out of alignment. I think it's just most people don't want to say it out loud. I'm really curious if you feel like a lot of this is business externalities. So,
Yeah.
it's a really intriguing thought. The systems that created this mess, they were good at creating this mess. They did some other things, but they also created this mess. That's what they're going to do. So looking at them to clean up this mess probably doesn't make sense. Is a lot of this business externality, or do you feel like it would have come no matter what? So it wasn't externalities, it just the systems don't help clean it up.
I mean, the systems, and I mean, by systems, like, thinking really macro, right? Just how
Right.
we engage in, commerce, how we govern ourselves, how we regulate things. Yeah, like, it worked for a time, but it was already pretty rickety, right? Before this, like, people were already, there was a lot of tension. That's why Barack Obama was able to get elected. That's why Trump was able to get elected. That's why people are really into folks like AOC or Warren or Bernie Sanders, because, these were people who were saying pretty clearly, hey, these systems don't work for you, do they? And I'm going to do something about it. The problem is that they haven't really been able to keep their promise. There's been at best, incremental changes around the margins to make the system slightly less terrible, right? Or in the case of certain administrations, like they didn't care how terrible if it met their ideological needs. So, right, I think that looking at how, for example, our healthcare system is structured, it's not working. The way that our educational system is, it's not working. Congress is clearly a complete, basket case. Like that's not working. Like
That's a very polite term for what's going on in Congress right now.
Right, but
yeah,
if you think about it, if you take a really big step back, Congress in its time was incredibly innovative in terms of the structure, but that was the 18th century.
Yep.
And we don't live in that time anymore, where the best that we can do is gather together as many votes as possible and then send that person to talk to some other people that other people have selected. Like we don't even have to do that anymore. We could also just like vote using our mobile phones like we do for American Idol. So, at what point, right, if more people literally are voting in American Idol, which that was the case for a while, then are actually showing up at the polls, like something is wrong, right? Like we're not designing for the future. We're trying to hold on to this past. I mean, I read something by a conservative, the other day, who they called the Constitution colorblind. It's like, yeah, no, I mean, that's not like, there's like a lot of racism just like baked in there. Like the fact, for example, that Black people were considered 5/8 of a person. Like,
I was going to say the
like,
5/8 rule was part of the Constitution.
Yeah, it was not in any way colorblind. They were actually pretty explicit about it. So I think that there are people who, right, yearn for this yesterday that didn't exist and is not going to exist.
And COVID, by what you are saying, has sort of exacerbated our yearning, right? I mean, my wife will tell you, I look back at the 70s with the absolute rose-colored glasses that we were all wearing back then, because I'm like, it was the coolest decade with the coolest music and the coolest clothing. But, I'm aware that I'm doing that. I think what's happening as a society that you're calling out is that we're unaware of the fact that we are looking back on the way things used to be, trying to get there in a context that is fundamentally shifted, with this sort of wistful yearning of what life could be like if we just go back to the same rigid structures that kept communities segregated, funding unavailable, votes disenfranchised, and people in systemic issues oppressed, right?
Yeah, there are people who are very threatened by the fact that the status quo must change. Like there is no choice. Like it must change in order for us to get out of this period. So yeah, back to your question, Tim, in terms of business externalities, those externalities are now internal. I mean, you just can't treat people the same way that you did before. You cannot work the same way in which you worked before. The products and services that people are going to need are going to change, and the needs that people have. There are people who need to be retrained because the work that they did before the pandemic is going to go away. It's not going to come back. And you also have nonprofits who are used to doing, for example, in-person work, on the ground, like field work. And field is never going to be the same again.
Field got real big in the pandemic.
Right. Yeah.
Sure, because all of a sudden they really had the old excuses of like, oh, but I know my community and I have this clipboard, and why would I share my old Excel spreadsheet of names or my Outlook list? Like, none of those excuses held water anymore. Like you had to innovate in order to actually even just fulfill the basics of your mission and report back to the philanthropists who are funding it. So, I really do think it is a moment in which, of course, everyone is trying to just, put one foot in front of the other and survive. But at the same time, it really is necessary to pull back and look at you know, how things are changing in order to adapt, to the new realities in front of us.
Can I ask a follow-up, Cheryl, on that? I want to know this. I've been candid about this in previous recordings. I went through a journey, particularly during the Trump administration, and also January 6th really did scar me personally because I was such a believer in the democratic system, and my whole life had been shaped towards, if we participate in democracy enough, democracy will bend. Um, and I think the journey for me personally in 2021 has been, where is change possible anymore? And so the question I have, that's a very meta question based on what you are saying, is the system itself, that sort of big word, the system, is the system itself broken enough to warrant whole scale replacement? And if so, with what? And if the system's not broke enough to warrant whole scale replacement, what are we doing wrong that these voices that are critical to participation in it, that have a direct effect on the day-to-day working lives of people in nonprofits or in the tech industry or in the startup world of, developer apps? What are we doing wrong that we need to do different so that we can make the system work for us again?
Well, that's a big question.
I do that. I'm sorry.
No, but I think those really are the questions that we need to be asking. There are all kinds of systems. There are big systems, right? There are small systems. There's plumbing systems. There's heating systems.
Yeah, I'm interviewing to be on my
systems.
town planning commission. I'm learning all about that, plumbing and sewer, and wow.
Yeah. It's a lot. It's a lot of responsibility. There's a lot of systems. Look, we can all look around and see that the system is broken. Okay, that the system is fundamentally, it has, has failed most of the American public, right? So, if you really embrace that, which I think most leaders in power have not, because the system works just fine for them. Like, they're okay with it, and they have an investment in, a vested interest in, mostly maintaining things the way they are, and, tossing people a bone like a child tax credit, which I don't want to dismiss it. It's probably kept a lot of people fed, and kept poverty at bay for many, many families and hungry children. But a child tax credit, like, it doesn't even begin to address, the challenges. We saw, in the pandemic, how, there were, in a time when a lot of people had to teach kids from home, how was that going to happen? Like, if you've got somebody working for minimum wage and their kid, you don't have internet access, you don't really have a great computer, and you actually have to go out because you're a single mom. Like, the system didn't work for any of the people we're talking about in that moment, and still doesn't. It didn't work that great before, but they were managing barely, right? They were surviving in that context, and in a context that, continues. In some of these places, kids still can't go to school. Or if they can, there's no job for that single mom to go back to if they were working in a restaurant, for example. That restaurant might have closed forever. Certainly you can, a lot of restaurants have closed forever here in the Bay Area where I live, that were hugely popular before the pandemic, and they're gone. So, I do think that because the system as we know it is broken for most people, yeah, we're going to have to take a wholesale approach to figuring out how do we make sure the system works for more people. And we've done it before. Like, it's not, this is doable. Like, we're not, so, for example, World War I and II, that was the extremely painful and traumatic process of moving most of the earth from feudal societies run by monarchs to either benevolent dictatorships that had some sort of democratic, engine or structure to it, at least in name only, perhaps, or, governments that were some kind of combination of capitalism, socialism, and democracy. those systems don't work anymore. It's not, again, the people for whom it does work don't want it to change, and yet there's a whole bunch of people who elect them, or that they represent, who, are starting to ask some big questions. So, what does that mean? You ask, like, what comes next? I think a lot of negotiation. We can see it right now, in the halls of power, where you have, people who, are shouting at the top of their voices that, we're going to have to do things differently in the future if we expect to, democratize success and prosperity. And there are people who are resisting that because they think that if they give that any kind of democratization where other people get more means somehow they might get less. And that's the attitude that we have to change.
That sort of perspective on, for lack of a better way of saying it, make the pie higher, right? I mean, I describe this as a rising tide lifts all boats. And the problem is that sometimes the tide rises 5 centimeters, and that's negligible to someone who already has a fancy boat, but it means the world to somebody who doesn't. And that might be enough for them to get where they're going next. What gives you hope? Because I have been short on hope and long on cynicism this year. What gives you hope? Because we haven't even begun to unpick a lot of the structural sort of outcomes of all of this. But how do you retain hope right now?
No, it's a great question. I mean, right, you're right. We have not unpicked or, unpacked, like, the reality of the structural outcomes to then look at the structures and start to, make some course corrections. Absolutely. Like, there's a lot of people who are in complete denial about that. What gives me hope is the creativity and resilience of human beings. Like, I do believe that we can figure it out. We can figure it out the easy way, like sans violence, with negotiation, or we can do it the hard way, like World War I and II. Like we can have a peaceful transfer of power, like, de Klerk to Mandela, or we cannot do that.
I love that you just invoked de Klerk to Mandela. By the way, thank you for that. Because, what I am looking at in some of the work that you're doing in particular, and I want to ask you to put on your VC hat for a minute, because, when we're looking at something like the impact seat and the work that it's trying to do, how do you create measurements and indicators that tell you that this is really actually sustaining that new hope versus just throwing good money after bad, trying to perpetuate the system that we're in? Because I would agree with you that the system's broken. What I think we're all disagreeing on is how to fix those mends. Like, is the system so broken that we need to throw it out, or is it just the limitation of our imagination around what's possible that's broken?
Oh, no, I disagree with you that there are people that everyone agrees that the system is broken. I mean, conservatives are.
Okay, everyone I know.
Yeah, I mean, and conservatives have been pretty
Fair.
clear, and there are even
Yeah.
some,
Yeah.
like, you've got a Joe Manchin, who's basically like, I don't want to change the system because then that might give people hope or expectations of help in the future.
Yeah. We don't want to like, create the idea that government should be there for the people.
Yeah, or should help you in any way.
Yeah.
Even though it's your money. It's your money. Like, that seems also to have gotten lost in the context that we're talking about taxpayers' money. Like, the idea theoretically of taxes was that, you pay into this system, and the system, together, if we pull our resources, you get it back. Actually, it comes back to you in the form of roads and education, libraries, clean water. Like, that was the theory. And again, like, that concept, has really begun to erode, that the government feels like it's the government's money, not our money, right? So that's That's number one, right? Like, let's return to actually dialoguing about, like, that's our money that needs to come back to us in ways that we can feel and understand. Because right now, half of that budget goes to the military, and like, what are they spending that on exactly? People
Right.
should be asking more questions about that.
Absolutely.
But yeah, in terms of, though, what gives, what was the question again? Sorry.
Well, what gives you hope was the starting question, but then I had asked you, in explicit, what do you measure then to
Yeah.
direct this fix?
Well, look, as a VC,
Yeah.
there are parts in VC, venture capital,
Mhm.
for those who are unfamiliar. In the VC world, for those of us who are trying to make an impact with our investments and actually solve, big problems, not necessarily small problems, but bigger problems, even talking in that manner and making that a priority is a pretty major shift in the way that, for example, in the 20th century, right, that then people were investing. Like, that concept, is still novel to a certain extent. And when you look at, for example, the amount of venture funding of any kind, seed, pre-seed, seed, all the way through Series D, when you look at the amount that goes to women, it's still something like 2 to 4% of all venture funding going to female founders, which, if you understand that women buy 75 to 85% of everything, okay, look it up if you don't believe me. We buy all of the things. Those two numbers don't make any sense. Okay, that is some like 19th century thinking that would even in any way make any sense. I mean, why wouldn't you want the people who are some of the representatives of the people who are going to buy the product to inform you about the product or service? Right? Okay, so one of the things, for example, that gives me hope structurally, you've probably heard that the NASDAQ has changed their rules around boards. And it didn't get a lot of media, which I don't know why, because it's actually a really big deal. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, recently the NASDAQ trading platform said, look, starting now, we're going to give you a little time to figure it out, but starting now, you can't be listed on the NASDAQ unless your board has diverse representation. And you might think, your immediate thought might be like, oh, are they being nice? Like, is it virtue signaling? These lefty? No, they're doing it because it makes money. Okay, like, all of the studies show, all of the data shows that diverse-led firms are more innovative, they are more productive, they are more profitable. So if you want ROI, you need DEI. And taking away that excuse, because we're all in tech. You've heard the excuse like, oh, there's not the pipeline. Oh, I believe in meritocracy, like blah 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 blah. When you remove those excuses, then it's like, okay, if we're all acknowledging that diversity of that form makes more money, and you have said that the most important thing is to make money, how are you changing your business practices?
Yeah.
To make more money.
I mean, it's interesting just thinking about NASDAQ on that. Isn't another word for portfolio diversity? Like we have, like, there's nobody out there that would not say you have to have, a strategic portfolio. But when it comes to human capital, like, that's just been completely overlooked. Yeah. I
No,
think
exactly, Tim. And that's why I say, when logic leaves the room, you
Yeah.
can be sure that racism and sexism and homophobia have entered, because none of what I talked about just now makes any sense. Like, it doesn't make any sense, except it does, privilege, a certain group of, people, who've been trying to keep, these systems and this access to themselves, to their own benefit. Even if it costs them, it feels safer.
Yeah.
That kind of thinking is starting to crumble away.
Finally
Go ahead, Tracy.
learned. Oh, I was just going to say, I've finally learned in job interviews. Now, this took me 20 years or more in tech to finally learn in job interviews that when I'm talking to a leadership team member of an organization or a business owner who is selling me on the idea that what they are running is an absolute meritocracy and all ideas are valid, that actually doesn't mean I have a place. What that actually means is that they are saying in a very direct way, I believe in the status quo, and I believe that I benefit from the status quo. So you are here to benefit me benefiting the status quo. And that's why this is a meritocracy, because I benefited from that meritocracy, and now you need to imitate me. There is no space for you to be anything else other than that. That took me 20 years to figure out, and some really hard lessons along the way.
Oh yeah, meritocracy. Yeah, what it means is, well, I'm on top and I deserve to be on top.
Yeah, and I'm
I
blind to
deserve to
how
be
I
on
got
right.
here.
Yeah. I don't, let's not talk about that. I worked hard. Like, sure, you worked hard, but you asked about metrics. So, I'm a senior advisor on a fund, on a bunch of different funds, but this fund focuses on female led startups. And they told me, look, Cheryl, we worked really hard to weed as much bias out of our system as possible so that we could get more women of color founders funded. And they said, we felt like we did a pretty good job until it came to venture capitalists writing checks and these angels who, at least theoretically, said that this was a thing that they wanted to do. But it took them on average 6 or 7 introductions to funders to get a white female startup funded. It took them 50 to get a woman of color startup funded.
Wow.
So America literally asked me to do 10 times the work in order to get the same result, which is something I write about in my book, Mechanical Bull.
I was hoping you would pull that up.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, my startup Attentively was the first, as far as we know, with a Black female founder to be acquired by a NASDAQ company. There was a company before mine 20 years ago, probably. Juanita Lott was the first woman of color to have her company was bought by a New York Stock Exchange. So yeah, for that to have happened in 2016, something is wrong. It's not like Black women don't work hard. It's not like we don't have good ideas, right? Like, that's crazy. So, how do we start to build more logic? So in the book, I talk about that, how did I get through and how did I get to a successful exit, which, has been elusive for people, who come in a package like this. But I wrote the book that I wish that I'd had. Someone sat me down, after, the exit and said, look, Cheryl, more people have been to the moon, literally, than have done what you have done as an American. And you have an obligation to help others. So Mechanical Bull, it's not just my story. It has a lot of investors' stories. It has a diverse set of other founders' stories. But every chapter is describing the process. It describes the life cycle. But it's also, if you don't look like, a Harvard or Stanford dropout who is a white male who comes from an upper middle class family, here's the thing that's going to happen to you, maybe what the speed bump that might happen to you at this phase, and here's how to get over it. And at most chapters also have an investor insight, which if you're an investor who says that you want to help startups like this, here's a way in which you can be helpful now.
Can you give us an example of both a speed bump and an investor insight from a Mechanical Bull?
So a speed bump, for example, is just getting funding. As I mentioned, like if you have to plan, that it's going to take you. And when they told me that number, it made sense to me because at some point I figured out in the process in getting our first checks in for Attentively that it was a numbers game, that I was just going to have to knock on a lot of doors, in order to find that investor. And I didn't, I just intuited that. But yeah, it's going to take you longer and you're going to have to knock on more doors. And also, because there's, runway, right? There's usually it takes 6 to 12 months to have a funding cycle. If you are, a woman or you are a minority, or God help you if you're both, it might take you not 6 months, but 12 months to raise that money. And that has direct impact on your runway. You have to plan to stretch that money a little bit further, which is not fair. But right now it's the way it is. So, those are the things when we talk about structure, it should be, it shouldn't be perceived that businesses that are diverse led are riskier, because that's why it was hard to get those checks. And it's like, oh, I don't know, something doesn't feel right. I feel uncomfortable.
Oh,
right? Because
God, you
nobody
just
like
explained
says anything.
redlining.
Yeah, I feel uncomfortable, or maybe they feel more comfortable over there. Right?
Oh,
Yeah, like, no, that's no. Okay. They're not only are they less risky, like someone who is willing and able to talk to 50 funders, that's a person worth investing in. Right? That's a person who believes in their product. That's a person who is dynamic, willing to work hard, willing to do the research, which are all of the things that investors say that they want at the seed stage.
What do they really want? I mean, are they looking for what they have funded in the past? Is it just like they're just looking to do more of the same because that's less risky? What's what
Pattern
is it that they're
matching.
doing?
Yeah, pattern matching is a thing, that people often talk about, where, and that was a really big problem, where, there was a John Doerr, came right out. He's a big investor, right? Tracy's heard of him. She's nodding her head. And he came right out and said, when I see, a business, a startup that's led by, a white male dropout from Harvard or Stanford or MIT, I'm going to invest in that, because in the past, investing in that made me a lot of money, right? But there's a lot of people who aren't that, a lot of people. So, that's a challenge. So an investor insight, you asked for an example, in the past, like, for example, in tech, we're all technologists, there was this perception that, white men were driving, adoption, which I don't know that it was ever true, but that was the perception. So Google Glass would be an example, right, of, not understanding that women buy 75 to 85% of everything. They only tested it on white guys, basically, and on guys. They gave it out to a bunch of white nerds, thinking that would make it hip and cool and popular, when in fact, the people who drive, if you actually look at the numbers, again, this is where racism and sexism and homophobia distort market forces. You actually look at the data, the people who drive tech adoption are millennials, moms, and minorities, what used to be called minorities, right? So, by Apple understands that, almost every commercial they have is extremely diverse and has
very
probably
much
more
so.
people of
Yep.
color, right? So they get it, right? Of like, who, and there are women, actually in the commercial using it. So, so our CTO at my old company, Attentively, she was testing out Google Glass. She was an early adopter, and she said, I love this because I can take pictures with my kids, and not have to have a phone in front of my face, or, it feels more natural. But I wish there were some recipe apps. There are 4 golf apps and 0 recipe apps. And I'm going to quote her, I don't know who they're building this for.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's my investor insight, is like, are you actually thinking about why this product will or will not be successful, using the data and not your feelings or your sense of your own personal culture?
I did, in a different life, before I fell into nonprofit tech, and I'm very clear I did fall into nonprofit tech. I got a master's of public administration, and I was gearing up to be a policy wonk of some nature or another. For where those master's programs shunted you in the 90s was they were like, go work for the government, right? We'll teach you all the government stuff and you'll go do policy analysis. I moved out to the West Coast instead. And I wound up working for an organization called the Applied Research Center, which published a magazine called Color Lines Magazine. Cheryl, I know you know these places. The founder, Gary, would always say, you can't look at the intent of people doing policy. You have to look at the outcome of the policy itself. And at the time, that was a revolutionary way of doing policy analysis, which was now 20 years ago, because policy analysis was always as an extension of existing structures, not what the people who are on the ground were experiencing it. And then you sort of backwards engineer the policy. What you're saying makes a lot of sense to me, when you relate it to the struggles of people who are affected by wide scale policy decisions. I mean, one of the most interesting and heart-wrenching things I ever looked into was what was going on with downwinders on Navajo Nation, for example, and how policy didn't care. The policy was to drive the space race and the competition with the Soviet Union. The policy did not consider the outcome on the downwinders. And I want to know, what now do you think has changed in the industry? Because we were talking before we hit record about, the moment that 2020 gave us. I have some cynicism about its durability, but I feel like maybe you have more hope in terms of shifting the way that industries think about this, that produces a more equitable outcome.
Yeah, I don't even know if it's hope, Tracy. It's just, it's literally looking at, what's happening. I think everything you said about policy is correct. And even the concept of nonprofit tech, that is a thing, and I do a fair amount of talking to, younger people, in MBA programs or college programs. And I say, look, the job that I have now did not exist when I was in college. I was part of a cohort that created it. And that is especially true of your generation, that the jobs of the future aren't here yet, and you might have to invent them. And, everything that you're saying about policy is now being applied to, capitalism and businesses, where people are saying, look, which is, back to the future, certainly the early 20th century was a lot about that, right? The impact, but, you can't just start a company, with a certain intent and not look at the outcome. People are really demanding that, companies take responsibility for the outcome of what their businesses generate in the world. And, that's new, at least in this century. Okay, in this century, it's not new in the last century. A lot of the, workplace reforms, certainly were, driven by people saying, hey, it'd be cool if, you didn't have children, working and cutting their fingers off in factories. Yeah. Like, it'd be great if you allow people to, go to the bathroom, for example, in, this giant seamstress factory, or et cetera.
7-day work week, 40 hours.
Right.
I mean, you're talking about the early labor movement, right?
Yeah,
this is sort of like the 21st century version of that. I see where you're kind of heading. Yeah.
But it's beyond labor. If, for example, Facebook right now, as we speak, is under a lot of pressure for the fact that they looked at their own data and knew that Instagram, was harming teens, and did nothing. They did nothing. Okay. And that guy, their CTO, was recently gently fired. I don't know if people noticed that or not. And, he's been there. He was there for 13 years. He presided over all of this, failure to actually adapt in any way or take any responsibility for the outcomes of, Facebook's products. The person that they put in his place does give me a little bit of hope. It's the person who was running the hardware division at Facebook. And that, if you've used any of Facebook's hardware, like the Oculus Quest 2, I've got one right here. I have one at home and in the office. I've been using Portal, during this time, which is great. It allows you to tell augmented reality stories. It's a great, grandparent to grandchild facilitating. It's magical. I mean, those products might as well have been made by fairies from outer space. Like, they are so elegant, they're really well done. So my hope is that someone with at least like more a broader sense of sensitivity and ability to inspire their team, to literally creating magic, will do something to improve the newsfeed of Facebook and Instagram. But in the meantime, yeah, other outcomes are climate change. We have lived through, the ability of, all of these companies to pour whatever they wanted into the environment, again, with, in the latter part of the 20th century, some pushback, from the environmental movement, somewhat successful to at least make it slightly less terrible. But in the meantime, the climate change, they weren't successful really on that front. We're right, starting to get ankle deep in it, literally and figuratively. The systems that created climate change are not the ones that are going to get us out of climate change. End of story. Therefore, you have to look forward. You have to look forward to the people creating the things that will do that.
One of the things I hear you saying here, or I'm curious if I'm hearing you say it, is I think there's if there's a before and an after. The before is, you drive bottom line decision making in your company for shareholder value, and the after is going to be if that is also not creating value, or at least not creating negative value for the earth and for not just shareholders but the people buying your products, then you actually don't have a company. Talent won't show up there. Investors won't show up there. Your board will look at that and be like, I don't want my name attached to that. Is that, when you look at vectoring for the future and business strategy, is that what you see, like an actual double bottom line? If you are not hitting both of these, then a single doesn't cut it anymore.
Yeah, I think we're all seeing that, in play, where if you're not, and even that, like that concept of shareholder return, right? Like, if you're only investing, for example, in acquiring companies that are only led by white guys, you actually aren't driving the maximum shareholder value. Okay, you aren't. Like, so that, we can take that off the table. Like, if you are creating a world in which your shareholders are going to die because their fancy homes in Malibu are going to burn down, you're not creating shareholder value.
Yeah.
Okay. Like, so, I think we're in a process where, like, redefining, like, what do you really mean when you say shareholder value? Because it actually, like, 2 + 2 doesn't equal 5. My man. Yeah. Okay. So, like, please explain yourself again, like what you think you are doing with this company, and think about how you might make it different going forward. Because, yeah, you look at Facebook, and I have been a fan, I've been a Facebook user since before it was cool. A lot of my stuff, about my son, is probably the main way in which I keep in touch with a lot of my cousins, but they're having trouble recruiting. Yeah. That, like, recruiting is a lot harder for them, and so is retention, because of their policies. And then that starts to erode shareholder value because you're not as efficient as you used to be. So, I think that you're absolutely, Tim, you zeroed in on, the fallacy, right? The fantasies that we've been sold, just aren't cutting it in this period. We can all see it now. We're all starting to strip it away. COVID really forced us to look at a lot of that stuff.
Well, and a lot of this is going to drive scarcity to a degree where wealth is actually not able to insulate in the way that it used to. You see that in Portland, in the fires in Washington, and I think that's actually starting to drive a collective consciousness that has kind of been held by a few extremists, or considered extremists, that are now like going to be considered mainstream kind of overnight, which would be a very hard pill to swallow, by the way.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Let me show you just a super quick graphic. I don't know if you've seen this. This is from a deck that I did on generational wealth. And, you can see the numbers, right? Like, if you're white, this looks amazing for you, right?
Yep.
Congratulations, white people. Like that looks amazing. This looks slightly less amazing for people who are, people of color. And, if you juxtapose that in your mind with the fact that in just 20 years, most people are going to be these people, okay? In America, like this is not okay. Like this does not equal a safe, a safe functioning society. Like that looks like the French Revolution, okay? And
Yeah, absolutely.
like
That's
I mean,
humiliating and
25
embarrassing before
times
it's scary,
less,
you know.
like literally 25 times less sunny, you know,
right in
you
a way
know.
that like it just doesn't like even if
Oh,
you think that oh well, outcomes shouldn't be fair or equal, like the distance between those numbers, in terms of what that will do to our economy, if there are just fewer people who have more, right, to spend, and so many people who have so much less to spend, that's not, the middle class is what has always driven
yep.
American prosperity. And, if we think that, concentrating wealth and power in the hands of a few people is, going to spell, a peaceful and prosperous society, again, a fantasy. We can already see that unraveling right before our eyes.
Yeah.
Cheryl, one of the things that you're also implying in all of this is adjusting our expectations of timeline of delivery. Or at least that's what it feels like to me. And I don't have an answer personally yet for how do we make that leap in our thinking. So I believe everything. I mean, like I'm an absolute believer in what we've been talking about, but when confronted with a business that's like, look, that's great for 10 years from now, but what I really need to solve for is Q4 and Q1, and we're going to go
Yeah.
full tilt towards Q4 and Q1, and we'll worry about cleaning that up later. How do you break through that logic? How do you even begin to make a dent in that when it's always going to be, Q4, Q1 or Q2, Q3 that's coming up that's going to be driving the interest?
Oh, look, I've been a business owner for, it's starting to get to be 20 years now. Okay. And yeah, of course, you've got your numbers, that are right ahead of you. You want to end the year, in the black for sure. But, anyone who's not looking around at their competition, to figure
Mm,
out, okay, how am I positioning myself, within this marketplace? How can I differentiate myself? And, what does, where are the gaps, what are the problems, and are we really providing a solution? Your business isn't going to stay in business very long, if you're only thinking, 90 days ahead, right? Like, businesses that are successful long term, and most businesses fail in their first year in America, and of those that that succeed, most of those are gone by their third year. So if you want to make it past 3 years, you got to think past 3 years.
Yeah. I think that we've been surprised to find that philanthropy also is a lot more time bound in terms of its investment horizon than we expected. And so we've just engaged philanthropy as an organization in the last year. And that was surprising to us. Is it surprising to you? I mean, it seems like you've been in the philanthropy world longer. Um, does that track? Does that make sense?
No, it doesn't surprise me. Again, there, a lot of these folks are, products of the systems, right? And so
yeah.
they know those systems well. And, even as they are working to, improve people's lives, they're doing it within the context that they feel familiar with. And, in COVID, I was actually, both surprised and, heartened by the fact that a lot of, philanthropic institutions said, you know what, this is a year we know that we're only required to spend five whole percentage of our treasure, on helping other helping people. And this seems like a time when maybe we need to spend more than that maybe a lot more people need a lot more help right now. And that's going to be true for a while. It's going to take, this is a global, transformational, and traumatic event. We will never go back to normal. That's clear. Things are going to be different in some, very specific ways going forward, probably permanently. And, there are more people who are recovering, who are figuring out, how are we gonna make it, going forward. So, I do think that there are ways in which, foundations can support nonprofits in particular. Right now, so many nonprofits need training. We saw, in the wake of COVID, how far behind the nonprofit, tech infrastructure has become compared to corporate infrastructure.
Yeah.
And so, this is, it's really, as someone who sits at the juncture of both, seeing what people are doing, how they're approaching, tech, in service of goals in the corporate sphere versus, the nonprofit sphere, like 10 years behind, okay, easily. And so they need to get, in order to really achieve change, especially in this time, how are you, as a philanthropic leader, how are you helping your grantees get 10 years ahead, leapfrog 10 years ahead?
Yeah, that's been a personal pain source. It's like we can build 100-year clock, but we can't build 100-year foundation.
Right, and even if it's not 100 years, even if it's like 10, I'll take preparing your grantees now to actually be 10 years ahead of the people who are oppressing, right? Who are, the systems that are, keeping people down. And there was a time, I'm not talking about a thing that's not achievable. There was a time when, aside from porn, nonprofits were actually the cutting edge. Absolutely on the cutting edge and way ahead of corporations. And we were kicking their asses very successfully. And they felt that. They felt it and they figured it out. And they very much invested and upped their game, and accelerated forward in order to more effectively, in part, cope with nonprofits who are putting pressure on them. So, this is a problem. The knowledge gap and the skills gap, the strategic gap between, corporate technology and nonprofit technology, that's become a pretty wide chasm. And, that's a place where, foundations really can play a huge part, because look, it's hard for a grantee to come to a foundation and say, our digital game is not as tight as it could be. Can you help us? Right? That's a lot to ask. Whereas you already know, okay, we all lived through COVID, your grantees, have just barely, done probably the minimum in some cases, right, to be functional during COVID. So you need to help them move further faster in this time. And you can.
Yeah, we talked
so
to
inspiring.
Leon Wilson from the Cleveland Foundation, who talked a lot about this too at one point as well, and really hammered down on that idea that this is about acceleration, not reinforcing the status quo.
Yeah,
exactly. And
Any
it's possible.
burning
and it's
thoughts?
Useful.
I mean, Cheryl, this is the conversation that I could just gently go through for the rest of my day. I really am so grateful for the time you've spent. What's the burning thing that's on the tip of your tongue that you want to make sure gets out there in the world regarding all of this?
Well, no, I'm so grateful to you, Tracy, and you, Tim, for having me on. And yeah, I don't always get to, talk about, this stuff. I definitely see myself as a futurist. The way in which people are working now, all of my teams had been virtual and remote. Everyone just started working the way my team has been working for over a decade. So, I've been pretty good at sort of, seeing where the future is going. And yeah, I want people to have hope, at Do Big Things. Certainly, we wouldn't, we have an amazing team out there that works, side by side, with nonprofits to, build movements of millions of people, who actually do care about the future. At the impact seat, we're funding the future. We're building a new economy, with every investment, and an economy that hopefully will, again, work for more people and build more prosperity. So, that's what I'm focused on right now. And I hope that other people will, your takeaway will be, what am I doing, to impact the future, even as we all struggle through this present moment.
Gosh, thank you deeply.
Cheryl, thanks for that. Really appreciate it, and thank you for sharing hope. I think that there are a lot of futurists who kind of roll the other direction on hope, and I think it's an easier message to sell. And so I appreciate that. There's a lot of hope in what you talk about.
Well, easier for whom? One of my big fights that I've had with clients in the environmental movement is that the gloom and doom, it only attracts a certain group of people. And in fact, what inspires, and all of the research says this, what inspires most people, to work on behalf of the planet is love.
Yeah.
It's love and spirituality and positivity, and so, that's been really tough. So, Ted Lasso, one of the great things about, American culture, and one that continues somehow to buoy us along, is our relentless optimism. And it's that relentless optimism in the face of things that should make us less optimistic is why
overwhelming evidence.
It's overwhelming, right? Like evidence that it might be hard. It's why we win. It's why we do the impossible.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
Totally agreed. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Cheryl, thank you so much. I'm Tim Lockey.
I'm Tracy Kronzak, and you've been listening to Why It Matters.
Why It Matters is a thought leadership project of Now It Matters, a strategic services firm offering advising and guiding to nonprofit and social impact organizations.
If you like what you've heard, please subscribe, check out our playlists, and visit us at nowitmatters.com to learn more about us.